A glamorous Christmas party turns into a nightmare when a young woman is found murdered in the garden. The prime suspect? A husband with a secret affair. But as the investigation unfolds, hidden motives, a blood-stained scarf, and a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness reveal a web of lies far deadlier than anyone imagined. Who can be trusted when betrayal runs this deep? Love unraveling, gripping mysteries. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to never miss a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. The room was warm and cozy, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights strung across the mantel. Lisa sat on the couch, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of her phone as she scrolled through photos from last year's Christmas party. The pictures told a story of laughter and togetherness, a time when she felt secure in her marriage. But this year, something felt different. Across the room, Mark sat in the armchair, his face illuminated by the screen of his phone. He chuckled softly at something, then quickly locked the screen when he noticed Lisa glancing his way. She smiled faintly, but couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside her. Lately, Mark had been distant, more so than usual. He'd been coming home later, spending more time on his phone, and giving vague excuses for his behavior. Tonight was no different. His phone buzzed again, and Mark quickly excused himself, heading into the kitchen. Lisa's eyes followed him, her mind racing. She had tried to push aside her doubts, telling herself that she was overthinking. But as the days went on, the signs became harder to ignore. When Mark returned to the room, Lisa noticed something new. A faint lipstick stain on his collar. Her heart sank, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood up, pretending to adjust one of the decorations on the tree. From the corner of her eye, she saw him glance nervously at his shirt. The next morning, the house was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of soft Christmas music playing from the kitchen radio. Lisa sat at the table, sipping her coffee, watching Mark as he rifled through his coat for his car keys. She decided to test the waters. "So, what's the plan for the office Christmas party?" she asked casually, pretending to focus on her phone. Mark froze for a split second before answering, "Oh, you know, same as every year. Just a small thing with the team, nothing exciting." His tone was too light, almost dismissive, and it only deepened Lisa's suspicions. She pressed further. "Do you need me to come with you?" "I don't mind tagging along." He hesitated, then forced a laugh. "You hate these kinds of things, remember? It's just a boring work event. I'll be home early." Lisa nodded, pretending to accept his answer, but her mind was already working on a plan. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer she needed would be at that party. She decided then and there that she would go, whether Mark wanted her to or not. Later that day, while putting away laundry, Lisa's hand brushed against a crumpled piece of paper in Mark's coat pocket. She unfolded it and found a receipt for an expensive necklace. Her heart pounded as she read the details. It was a sleek gold chain with an engraving option, yet she hadn't received any such gift. She stared at the receipt, her mind filled with questions. Who was it for? Was it for Sophie, the younger co-worker she'd heard about during Mark's late-night calls? Lisa felt a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted to confront him then and there, but decided against it. She needed more proof, something undeniable. She tucked the receipt back into his pocket, careful not to leave any sign that she had found it. The night of the party arrived faster than Lisa expected. Mark was in the bedroom, adjusting his tie, while Lisa pretended to be engrossed in her makeup. She could feel his eyes on her in the mirror, but he didn't say anything. Once they were ready, Mark seemed surprised when Lisa grabbed her coat and said, "Let's go. I wouldn't want to miss all the fun." He forced a smile, his hesitation unmistakable. As they stepped into the car, Lisa promised herself that she would uncover the truth that night, no matter how much it hurt. The car ride to the party was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Mark fiddled with the radio, flipping through stations without settling on one, while Lisa stared out of the window, her mind replaying all the little signs she had ignored for too long. The streets were lined with festive lights, the city buzzing with holiday cheer, but inside the car, the tension was palpable. Mark finally broke the silence with a strained, "You're quiet tonight. Everything okay?" Lisa turned to him, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking about how much I love Christmas parties," she said, her tone light but her words calculated. Mark glanced at her, his face unreadable, then nodded. "Well, this one's nothing fancy. Don't get your hopes up." When they arrived at the venue, Lisa was momentarily taken aback by the grandeur. It was a luxury hotel ballroom, decked out with sparkling lights, towering Christmas trees, and a lavish buffet spread along one side of the room. Mark had definitely undersold the event. As they stepped inside, co-workers greeted them warmly, but Lisa couldn't help noticing how some of them glanced between her and Mark with faint curiosity. Were they surprised to see her here? She wondered. Mark introduced her to a few colleagues, keeping the interactions brief and moving her along quickly. Then Lisa saw her, the woman she had heard about but never met, Sophie. She was younger than Lisa had imagined, with perfectly styled blonde hair, a fitted red dress, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Sophie's eyes flicked toward Lisa, then to Mark, and a sly smile tugged at her lips. Sophie approached them with an air of familiarity that set Lisa on edge. "Mark, you didn't tell me you were bringing your wife," she said, her voice sweet but her tone unmistakably mocking. Lisa extended her hand with a polite smile. "I'm Lisa. It's nice to finally meet you," she said, emphasizing the word finally. Sophie's grip lingered a second too long, her smile never wavering. Throughout the night, Lisa watched them like a hawk. Mark tried to maintain a casual distance from Sophie, but it was clear that they were far more comfortable around each other than any two colleagues should be. Lisa noticed the subtle glances they exchanged, the way Sophie laughed just a bit too loudly at Mark's jokes, and how Mark's body language softened when he spoke to her. At one point, Lisa caught snippets of a conversation between Sophie and another co-worker. "I loved my gift. It was perfect," Sophie said with a giggle, clutching her necklace. Lisa's stomach churned. Was that the necklace? She couldn't be sure, but every instinct told her it was. Later, as Mark excused himself to get another drink, Lisa seized the opportunity to investigate. She made her way to the coatroom, pretending to look for her scarf, and discreetly checked Mark's pocket. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a small velvet box. She opened it and felt her chest tighten. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, engraved with the words, "Forever, S." Her heart raced as she tucked the box back into Mark's pocket, her mind reeling. The engraved words confirmed everything. It wasn't just an affair, it was a deep betrayal, one that Mark had no intention of ending. Lisa composed herself and returned to the party, her emotions a mix of anger, humiliation, and determination. When she spotted Mark again, he was standing by the bar with Sophie. They were leaning in close, their conversation hushed. Lisa stayed in the shadows, watching as Sophie placed a hand on Mark's arm. Her voice, though quiet, carried enough for Lisa to hear. "Meet me in the garden. We need to talk." Mark nodded subtly and Sophie slipped away unnoticed by the crowd. Lisa's grip tightened around her glass. Her mind raced as she decided what to do next. She wasn't leaving this party without answers. Lisa followed Sophie out of the ballroom, keeping a careful distance to avoid being seen. The venue's sprawling garden was dimly lit, with only a few twinkling fairy lights strung along the trees. The festive cheer of the party faded behind her as the cold night air sharpened her focus. Her heels crunched lightly on the gravel path, but she stopped just short of the garden's entrance, positioning herself behind a large hedge. From her vantage point, she could see Sophie pacing near a bench, glancing toward the ballroom's glass doors. Minutes later, Mark appeared, his hands shoved into his coat pockets as he approached Sophie. They exchanged a few words, their voices low. Lisa strained to hear them, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out the faint sounds of the party in the distance. She stepped closer, careful to keep herself hidden. "I thought we agreed we'd wait until after the holidays," Mark said, his tone a mixture of frustration and pleading. Sophie crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "And I thought you said you'd talk to her by now. How long do you expect me to wait, Mark? I'm not some secret you can hide forever." Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Sophie. She's my wife. This isn't something I can just end overnight." Lisa's stomach churned as the weight of his words hit her. Any lingering doubts she'd clung to were shattered. This wasn't just a passing infidelity. It was a full-blown affair, complete with promises and plans for a future that didn't include her. She felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she forced herself to stay silent, her eyes glued to the scene unfolding in front of her. Sophie stepped closer to Mark, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't get it, do you? If you don't tell her, I will. I'm tired of sneaking around. I deserve better than this, Mark." For a moment, Lisa thought Mark might actually take a stand and end things with Sophie, but instead, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just give me time, okay? I promise I'll handle it. You just have to trust me." Lisa's fingers dug into her palms as she fought the urge to confront them right then and there. She took a step back, her heel catching on a loose stone. The sound was faint, but it was enough to make Sophie turn her head sharply in Lisa's direction. For a terrifying moment, their eyes almost met, but Lisa ducked behind the hedge, holding her breath. Sophie hesitated, her gaze scanning the darkness, but Mark waved it off. "It's probably just the wind," he said dismissively. Sophie didn't look convinced, but let the moment pass. Lisa slipped back toward the ballroom, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. Her anger burned hot, but beneath it was a cold, creeping sadness that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of their life together, the promises they had made, and how easily Mark had thrown it all away. But she wasn't going to let this end quietly. If he thought she would stay silent and let him get away with this, he was sorely mistaken. Back inside, Lisa headed straight for the coat room, her heart pounding. She needed proof, something concrete to expose Mark's lies. She found his coat again and quickly retrieved the velvet box. The bracelet inside glinted under the dim light, its inscription mocking her with its sickening sweetness. "Forever, S." She snapped the box shut and tucked it into her clutch, a grim determination settling over her. As she made her way back into the party, she spotted Mark re-entering the ballroom from the garden. He looked composed, as though he hadn't just promised another woman he'd leave his wife. Lisa clenched her fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't the time to explode. Not yet. Mark noticed her and walked over, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, I was looking for you. You okay?" he asked, placing a hand on her arm. Lisa stared at him, her expression unreadable. She nodded slowly. "I'm fine, just needed some air." She didn't miss the flicker of relief that crossed his face. He had no idea what she'd seen, what she knew. The thought of his obliviousness only fueled her resolve. She smiled faintly, playing the part of the unsuspecting wife for just a little longer. As the night wore on, Lisa began to notice the subtle dynamics among the partygoers. Whispers floated through the air, and every now and then someone would glance her way before quickly looking away. It was clear that many of Mark's co-workers knew, or at least suspected, what was going on. The humiliation of it all stung deeply, but it only made Lisa more determined to take control of the situation. When Sophie reappeared, her confidence seemed renewed, her steps lighter. Lisa watched as she sauntered across the room, her gaze landing on Mark. She touched the necklace around her neck, smiling softly to herself. The same necklace Lisa was almost certain was the one from the receipt. Lisa's fingers tightened around the clutch in her lap. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. As Sophie passed by, Lisa stood and followed her, weaving through the crowd until they were near the far end of the room, away from prying eyes. Sophie turned, startled to see Lisa standing so close. "Oh, Mrs. Harrington," she said, her tone overly polite. "Enjoying the party?" Lisa smiled, though her eyes were cold. "Oh, I'm enjoying it more than I expected," she said. Her gaze flicked to the necklace, and Sophie noticed. For the first time that night, Sophie faltered, her smile slipping just slightly. Lisa stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "You might want to be careful, Sophie. Not all gifts are meant to last." Sophie stared at her, uncertainty flickering across her face. Before she could respond, Lisa turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing there, the confidence she'd carried all night beginning to waver. Lisa returned to the main party floor, her heart thundering in her chest. The encounter with Sophie had been a small victory, but it wasn't enough. Mark's betrayal ran too deep, and Sophie's arrogance only made it worse. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting between Mark, who was chatting with a group of colleagues near the bar, and Sophie, who had retreated to a corner, her expression more subdued now. Lisa's anger boiled beneath the surface, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose control yet. She needed to think carefully, act deliberately. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her dress, and made her way toward the garden again, determined to piece together more of the puzzle. The cold night air greeted her as she stepped outside. The garden was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of distant conversations carrying over from the ballroom. Her steps faltered when she noticed something unusual near the bench where she had seen Mark and Sophie earlier. A scarf lay crumpled on the ground, partially hidden under the bench. It wasn't hers, and it didn't look like anything Mark owned. She crouched down, picking it up, and noticed faint smears of what looked like blood along the edge. Her breath caught. She looked around, her heart pounding harder now as a creeping sense of unease settled over her. "Lisa?" Mark's voice cut through the silence, startling her. She turned sharply to see him standing a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to his tone that she didn't like. "What are you doing out here?" For a moment, Lisa froze, the scarf still in her hands. She quickly tucked it behind her back, straightening up. "Just needed some air," she said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "It's a little stuffy inside." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step closer. "You've been acting strange all night. Is there something you want to tell me?" His voice was calm, but there was a distinct sharpness to it now. Lisa forced a smile, stepping away from him slightly. "I could ask you the same thing, Mark," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I think we both know the answer to that." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he glanced past her toward the bench, his eyes lingering for just a moment, too long. Lisa followed his gaze, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't worried about her being out here. He was worried about what she might find. Before Mark could say anything else, voices from the ballroom interrupted them. Two co-workers stepped into the garden, laughing and chatting, completely oblivious to the tension between Lisa and Mark. Lisa seized the opportunity to slip away, clutching the scarf tightly in her hand as she made her way back inside. Her mind raced with questions. Whose scarf was it? Was the blood real? And why did Mark seem so uneasy about her being out there? Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere felt heavier now. Lisa's eyes immediately sought out Sophie, who was no longer in her corner. She scanned the room but couldn't find her anywhere. Unease churned in her stomach. Sophie had been so smug, so confident earlier. Where had she disappeared to? Lisa made her way to the bar, ordering a glass of wine and taking a moment to gather her thoughts. She sipped slowly, trying to make sense of everything. The scarf, the blood, Sophie's sudden disappearance. It all felt connected, but she couldn't quite piece it together. She glanced at Mark, who was back at the bar, but this time he was alone, his expression dark and brooding. He seemed lost in thought, his drink untouched in front of him. Suddenly, a scream shattered the air. The chatter in the ballroom died instantly, replaced by murmurs of confusion and alarm. Lisa turned sharply toward the sound, her heart lurching. A group of people had gathered near the glass doors leading to the garden. She pushed her way through the crowd, her breath coming in shallow gasps, until she reached the front. The sight stopped her cold. Sophie's body lay crumpled on the garden path, her red dress stark against the snow. Her blonde hair fanned out around her head, and there was blood, too much blood, staining the pristine white beneath her. Someone knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, but their pale, stricken face told Lisa everything she needed to know. Sophie was dead. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. The festive atmosphere of the party shattered in an instant. Lisa felt the room spin as a wave of nausea rolled over her. She clutched the edge of the doorframe for support, her mind reeling. Sophie was dead. The woman who had threatened to expose Mark's affair, the woman who had been bold enough to flaunt it in front of her, was now lying lifeless just feet away. Mark appeared beside her, his face ashen. "Lisa," he started, but she stepped away from him, her stomach twisting at the sight of him. She couldn't even look at him, couldn't hear whatever excuse he was about to offer. Someone shouted for the police, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, leaving only a few people standing near Sophie's body. Lisa's hand instinctively went to her clutch, the weight of the velvet box a cold reminder of everything she had discovered that night. She glanced at Mark again, her anger bubbling to the surface. For the first time, she wondered just how far he had gone to keep his secrets hidden. The garden was now cordoned off, and police officers moved swiftly, securing the scene and asking pointed questions to the stunned guests. The air was thick with tension, the festive lights and decorations now feeling grotesquely out of place against the backdrop of tragedy. Lisa stood near the edge of the ballroom, gripping her wine glass tightly. Her thoughts were chaotic, bouncing between disbelief, fear, and anger. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the garden where Sophie's lifeless body lay, partially obscured by the growing number of investigators. Mark was nowhere to be seen, and that absence gnawed at her. She scanned the room, searching for him, but her focus shifted when a detective approached the group nearest to her. He was tall, with a commanding presence that quieted the room as he introduced himself. "Detective Graham," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. "We're conducting an investigation into what happened tonight. I'll need statements from everyone who was here." The detective's eyes briefly landed on Lisa, and she felt an instinctive urge to compose herself. She didn't want to look shaken, though every fiber of her being was trembling. As he moved on, she caught sight of Mark returning to the room, his expression carefully neutral. He walked directly to her, avoiding eye contact with everyone else. "Lisa," he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one around them could hear, "we need to talk." Her stomach tightened. "Now, you think this is the right time for that?" she hissed, keeping her voice equally low. Mark glanced over his shoulder, then leaned closer. "You don't understand. I didn't—" He stopped himself, his jaw clenching as he struggled to find the right words. "It's not what it looks like." Lisa stared at him, her disbelief mounting. Not what it looks like? Sophie is dead, Mark, and you were the last person seen with her. Her words were sharp, cutting through his attempts to placate her. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his composure faltering. I didn't kill her, he whispered urgently. I was with her, yes, but I left her in the garden. She was fine when I walked away. Lisa narrowed her eyes, her instinct screaming that there was more he wasn't saying. Why were you even out there with her in the first place? What were you talking about, Mark? Her tone was cold, laced with accusation. He hesitated, his gaze darting to the growing police presence in the room. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you believe me. I didn't do this. Lisa's laugh was bitter, almost cruel. Believe you? After everything I've seen tonight, you expect me to just take your word for it? Her voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby guests. She stepped back, shaking her head. I don't even know who you are anymore. Before Mark could respond, Detective Graham approached them, his notepad in hand. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington? He asked, his tone polite but firm. Both Lisa and Mark turned to him, their argument immediately forgotten in the presence of authority. I'd like to ask you both a few questions, the detective continued. His sharp eyes lingered on Mark for a moment before shifting to Lisa. Separately, if you don't mind. Lisa nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief. Anything to put some distance between herself and Mark. She followed the detective to a quieter corner of the ballroom, her heart racing. This was her chance to speak her truth, to lay out everything she knew. And if Mark was involved in Sophie's death, she wasn't going to protect him. Not anymore. Lisa sat across from Detective Graham in a quiet, dimly lit corner of the ballroom, the hum of subdued voices and clinking glasses barely audible in the background. The detective studied her for a moment, his expression calm but probing, as though he could see right through her. He flipped open his notepad and clicked his pen, the sound sharp in the tense air. Mrs. Harrington, he began, his tone steady and professional, I understand this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about tonight. Let's start simple. Did you know the victim, Sophie? Lisa swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her chair. I knew who she was, she admitted, her voice measured. She was my husband's co-worker. Detective Graham nodded, jotting down her response. Did you speak with her at any point tonight? Yes, Lisa said, her voice tightening slightly. Briefly, it wasn't a long conversation. The detective's pen paused mid-note, his eyes narrowing slightly. And how would you describe that interaction? Lisa hesitated, the memory of Sophie's smug smile and dismissive tone flashing in her mind. Tense, she finally admitted. She wasn't subtle about her relationship with my husband. Detective Graham's expression didn't change, but Lisa could feel his scrutiny intensify. You're saying she and your husband had a personal relationship beyond work? Lisa nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady her voice. Yes, I suspected it for weeks, but tonight it became obvious. I saw them together in the garden earlier. The detective leaned forward slightly. What did you see, exactly? They were arguing, Lisa said carefully, her words deliberate. I overheard her telling him to leave me, and Mark, he didn't deny anything. He just tried to calm her down. Detective Graham scribbled something in his notebook before looking up again. How did that conversation end? Lisa felt a lump form in her throat as she relived the moment. Mark came back to the party, she said quietly. I stayed outside for a little while, trying to process everything. When I went back inside, I couldn't find Sophie. The next time I saw her, she was... Lisa's voice broke, and she gestured vaguely toward the garden. You know. The The detective gave her a moment, then continued. When you were outside, did you notice anything unusual? Anyone else around? Lisa's mind raced, her thoughts flashing back to the scarf she had found near the bench. She hesitated, torn between protecting herself and revealing what she knew. Finally, she decided there was no point in hiding it. I found something, she said cautiously. A scarf, near where Sophie and Mark were arguing. It had blood on it. Detective Graham's pen froze mid-note. His eyes locked on hers. Where is the scarf now? Lisa's grip tightened on her clutch. She opened it slowly, pulling out the folded scarf and handing it to the detective. He carefully took it, inspecting the dark stains along the fabric before placing it into an evidence bag. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. This could be important. Lisa nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt exposed now, vulnerable, as though handing over the scarf had stripped away her last layer of control over the situation. The detective leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. One last question for now. Do you think your husband is capable of harming Sophie? Lisa's breath caught. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. She thought of Mark's lies, his betrayal, his desperation in the garden. She thought of the cold detachment in his voice when he tried to convince her it wasn't what it looked like. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but I wouldn't put anything past him tonight. The detective nodded, closing his notepad. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. I may need to speak with you again later. Lisa watched as he walked away, her chest tightening. She had told the truth, or at least as much of it as she could. But as she sat there alone, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was far darker than even she could imagine. And if Mark was hiding something, she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Lisa sat alone, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The scarf, Sophie's death, Mark's lies, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet fit together. Across the room, she saw Detective Graham approach Mark. Her husband's face was a mixture of forced calm and barely concealed tension. She watched as the detective led him to another corner of the room, far enough away that their conversation couldn't be overheard. Mark's body language was defensive from the start, arms crossed, shoulders stiff. Lisa couldn't hear what he was saying, but his gestures were animated and his face flushed as he spoke. Detective Graham remained still, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Mark's obvious agitation. Lisa's stomach churned. What was Mark telling him? Was he lying his way out of this, just like he had lied to her? Unable to sit still any longer, Lisa stood and made her way toward the bar. She ordered a glass of water, needing something to steady her nerves. As she sipped, she overheard fragments of conversations among the guests. Whispers about Sophie's affair with Mark, about Lisa's confrontation earlier in the night, and, most chillingly, about how some people had seen Mark leave the ballroom just minutes before Sophie's body was found. Lisa's grip tightened around the glass. The evidence was stacking up against Mark, but something didn't sit right with her. If Mark was involved, why would he come back to the party so quickly? And what about the scarf? It wasn't his. Was there someone else involved? Her thoughts were interrupted when Rachel, her closest friend, appeared at her side. "Lisa," Rachel said, her voice low and urgent. "Are you okay? I've been looking for you." Lisa turned to her, grateful for the familiar face. "No, Rachel, I'm not okay," she admitted. "Everything about tonight is a nightmare. Sophie's dead, and Mark, I don't know what to think anymore." Rachel placed a comforting hand on Lisa's arm. "I heard people talking. They're saying Mark and Sophie were seen arguing outside." She paused, lowering her voice further. "Do you think he... You know..." Lisa shook her head, more to clear her thoughts than to answer the question. "I don't know. He's lied to me about so much, but murder, That's a line I never thought he could cross. Rachel frowned, her gaze flicking across the room to where Mark was still speaking with Detective Graham. Be careful, Lisa. If he's capable of cheating, who knows what else he's capable of? Just keep your guard up. Lisa nodded, appreciating the warning, but feeling more confused than ever. Rachel left her side after a brief hug, and Lisa found herself alone again, her mind racing. If Mark was guilty, why hadn't he tried to run? Why was he standing there, calmly answering questions from the police? And if he wasn't guilty, then who was? Her thoughts were interrupted again when Detective Graham returned, this time addressing the entire room. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said, his voice commanding attention. "We're now treating this as a homicide investigation. Nobody is to leave until further notice. We'll need to conduct more interviews and collect additional evidence." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd, but Lisa barely registered them. Her focus was on Mark, who had returned to the bar, his expression unreadable. She set her glass down and moved toward him, her steps purposeful. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm as she reached his side. Mark looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Not now, Lisa. I'm already dealing with enough." "No," she said sharply. "We're doing this now. I need to know the truth, Mark. All of it." He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with her tone, but finally sighed and nodded. "Fine," he said. "Let's talk, but not here." Mark led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Lisa folded her arms, her glare fixed on him. "Start talking," she demanded. "What were you doing outside with Sophie? And don't you dare lie to me." Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "She wanted me to leave you," he said finally, his voice low. "She was threatening to expose the affair if I didn't." Lisa's stomach turned, but she kept her expression cold. "And what did you say?" "I told her I needed more time," Mark admitted. "She didn't take it well. She got angry, started yelling, and then I left. That's it, Lisa. I didn't hurt her." Lisa studied him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. His words sounded plausible, but her gut told her there was more he wasn't saying. "If you didn't hurt her, then who did?" she asked. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might actually have an answer, but instead he shook his head. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but whoever it wasn't me." Lisa didn't know whether to believe him. The Mark she thought she knew had already proven to be a lie. And yet, something about his tone, the desperation in his voice, made her hesitate. For now, at least, the truth felt as elusive as ever. The atmosphere in the ballroom was heavy, the weight of suspicion and fear pressing down on everyone. Lisa sat at a small table near the edge of the room, her thoughts spiraling. She replayed every moment of the night in her mind. The garden, Sophie's words, Mark's desperation, and the bloodied scarf. None of it made sense. If Mark wasn't lying about leaving Sophie alive, who else could have been involved? And why? Her thoughts were interrupted when Detective Graham approached her again, his expression grim but focused. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, motioning for her to follow. "We need to speak privately." Lisa's heart sank as she stood and followed him to an empty meeting room adjacent to the ballroom. Inside, the detective closed the door, turning to face her with an unreadable expression. "We've gathered more evidence," he began, his tone measured, "and I need you to be honest with me about everything you know." Lisa nodded, her voice shaking. "I've told you everything I know. I found the scarf, I overheard them arguing, and I don't know who else could have done this." Detective Graham's gaze didn't waver. "The scarf you handed over matches the victim's blood, but it also has partial fingerprints on it. Preliminary analysis suggests they belong to you." Lisa froze, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "What? That's impossible. I only picked it up. I didn't hurt her." The detective raised a hand, calming her. "I believe you didn't hurt her, but the fingerprints complicate things. I need you to think carefully. Did you see anyone else outside when you were in the garden? Anyone who might have left that scarf behind?" Lisa's mind raced, the memory of the garden now a blur of emotions and fragments. She closed her eyes, willing herself to focus. Then it hit her. She remembered a shadow, a figure she had barely registered at the time, moving quickly along the far edge of the garden, near the hedges. At the time, she'd thought it was just her imagination, but now the image came back clearer. "There was someone else," she said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but I saw a shadow near the hedges. It was quick, like they were trying not to be seen." Detective Graham's eyes sharpened. "Did you recognize anything about them? Height, build, clothing?" Lisa shook her head, frustrated with herself. "No, it was too dark and I was too focused on Mark and Sophie." The detective nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes. "That's helpful. We'll have officers search the area near the hedges for anything they might have missed." Just then, an officer knocked on the door, stepping in with a sense of urgency. He handed Detective Graham a small evidence bag. Inside was a sleek, bloodied knife. "Found this near the hedges," the officer said. "Looks like someone tried to toss it into the bushes." The sight of the knife sent a chill down Lisa's spine. The detective examined it carefully before looking back at her. "Mrs. Harrington, you're certain you didn't see anyone near this area?" Lisa nodded, her throat dry. "I swear I didn't." Detective Graham turned to the officer. "Get this to forensics immediately. I want prints and DNA analysis as soon as possible." As the officer left, the detective turned back to Lisa. "This changes things. If the killer tried to dispose of the weapon nearby, they might not have had time to leave the premises. We're locking the venue down completely." Lisa returned to the ballroom, her nerves frayed. She scanned the room, watching the faces of the guests, wondering if the murderer was still among them. Mark caught her eye and walked over, his expression tense. "What's going on now?" he asked quietly. Lisa hesitated, debating whether to share what she knew. Finally, she leaned closer, her voice low. "They found the knife near the hedges. They think the killer is still here." Mark's face paled, his eyes darting around the room. "You don't think it's me, do you?" Lisa's gaze hardened. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mark. But if it wasn't you, then who?" Before he could respond, Detective Graham's voice cut through the murmurs in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, holding up a hand for silence, "we've recovered new evidence that may lead us to the person responsible for tonight's tragedy. Until further notice, no one is allowed to leave." The guests erupted into whispers and murmurs, tension mounting with every passing second. Lisa's pulse raced as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't know who the killer was, but she knew one thing for certain: the truth was about to come out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again.